The aroma of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the dining room, but I barely noticed. I sat quietly at my parents' oak table, picking at the carefully arranged vegetables, while Marissa, my daughter-in-law, chattered on about her latest work project. My son, Robert, nodded along, occasionally glancing at me as if I would share her enthusiasm. My parents, Mildred and George, smiled politely, completely absorbed in the conversation. "I have something to tell you all," Marissa began, her tone deceptively casual. I looked up from my plate, sensing the shift in her voice. "We've already shipped our furniture," she said, bouncing her youngest on her knee. "Mom and Dad agree your beach house is empty for 6 months. So we're moving in." I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth, my breath caught. And for a moment, the words didn't fully register. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My parents, predictably, smiled and nodded as if this were the most reasonable thing in the world. "Well, it's sitting empty anyway," my mother added softly, refilling her wine glass. My beach house, the retreat I had spent decades restoring, weekend by weekend, each room carefully designed to be my escape from the chaos of family obligations. Every nail, every coat of paint, every carefully chosen piece of furniture had been a part of me, a place where I could breathe, reflect, and finally feel at peace. And now, Marissa expected to claim it, as though years of planning and personal investment were invisible. I stared down at my plate, trying to steady the rush of disbelief and anger. Could they really decide this without asking me? When do you finally say no to family entitlement? I knew I had to respond, but I also knew that a hasty reaction would give them exactly what they wanted, an excuse to override my wishes again. I needed clarity, control, and a plan, and I needed it fast. I cleared my throat, setting down my fork. "Let's talk about this properly," I said evenly, though my mind was already running ahead, weighing options, calling contractors in my head, and considering the first steps I would take to protect what was mine. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of my words settling over everyone, and I realized this evening was only the beginning. Marissa leaned back in her chair, a satisfied smile on her face, as if she had already won the argument. "You understand, Liana," she said. "Our renovations are going to take at least 6 months. We don't have anywhere else to stay, and the kids are excited about the beach. It just makes sense." My parents nodded along, as if logic alone justified her intrusion into my life. I kept my expression neutral, though my mind raced. 6 months, half a year of my sanctuary, my carefully restored retreat, handed over without my consent. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to recall the calm I had maintained the previous evening. And yet, the memory of past patterns of entitlement made my stomach tighten. I remembered the weekend Marissa had borrowed my car just for a quick trip and returned it 3 months later with a dented bumper and a broken tail light. Or the $5,000 she asked to borrow for a photography project that somehow became $20,000 I never saw again. Each incident had been excused, rationalized by my parents with gentle reminders of family loyalty. And each time, I had swallowed my frustration, telling myself it wasn't worth the argument. But this was different. The beach house wasn't a tool to lend. It was a personal creation, a refuge from the constant demands of family expectations. It represented decades of work, planning, and care. I realized that every compromise I had made in the past had subtly eroded my sense of control, allowing others to assume that my possessions, my time, and my energy were theirs for the taking. I set down my fork, drawing the attention of the table. "I understand your situation. I said evenly. But this isn't something I can accommodate without planning and discussion. My house is not a fallback for anyone's convenience. My voice was calm, but firm, a tone I had rarely used with them, and one I had long avoided because it always seemed to trigger resistance. As I spoke, I felt a quiet certainty building within me. The years of concessions, the quiet compromises, the overlooked frustrations they had led to this moment. I would no longer allow entitlement to override respect, and I would make it clear that my boundaries, my home, and my decisions were not negotiable. The clatter of dishes and soft murmurs around the table faded into the background as I envisioned the first steps I would take, setting the stage for the confrontation that was inevitable and necessary. I took a deep breath and set my fork down deliberately, letting the silence stretch for a moment. "I appreciate your situation," I began, my voice steady, "but the beach house isn't available. I have contractors scheduled, and renovations are already in motion. The agreements were signed months ago." Marissa's eyes widened, and her hand froze midair, as if she could physically grasp the words and make them disappear. "Wait, what do you mean renovations?" she asked, her voice tight. You thought it would be sitting empty for 6 months," I interrupted gently, though the firmness in my tone left no room for argument. "The house is my property, and it has plans that cannot simply be postponed. I need it to be safe and functional for the coming season, and the contractor schedule cannot be shifted at a whim." My parents exchanged a look, Mildred's eyebrows knitting together. "But you hardly use it anyway," she said softly, as though her reasoning should persuade me. "It's just sitting there. This could help your son's family." I kept my expression calm, though my mind churned. This was exactly the sort of argument I had faced countless times before. Each concession I had made over the years, loans that disappeared, favors given and forgotten, had been justified by gentle reminders of family loyalty. And each time, I had swallowed my pride, thinking compromise was the right path. But this time, compromise would mean erasing my own plans, surrendering the sanctuary I had worked decades to create. Marissa's mouth opened again, likely to argue, but I continued. "I've anticipated this conversation. I brought copies of the contractor agreements. Demo crews start next Monday, and the renovations will take at least 8 weeks. Any furniture delivered or moved into the house before then will have to be redirected. The house is not available for use for anyone until these plans are complete." The room fell silent, a tension that had been simmering now settling into something heavier. I could sense Marissa calculating, plotting her next move, while my parents wavered, unsure how to enforce their well-meaning intentions without overriding my authority. I allowed the quiet to hang just long enough for the weight of my words to sink in, letting the reality of the situation settle over them. I would not be swayed by expectation or manipulation. As I gathered my notes and contracts, I felt a surge of clarity, knowing that the first decisive steps toward protecting my home and myself had been taken, setting the stage for the next phase of confrontation. The next morning, I drove out to the beach house, the salty air brushing against my face, carrying with it a sense of determination. The contractors had arrived earlier, setting up scaffolding and marking the rooms for demolition, but my attention was elsewhere. Today, I was focused on security. Cameras would cover every entry point, alarms installed at the doors and windows, and smart locks programmed so that only I held access codes. Every precaution was necessary. I had learned over decades that family entitlement could be persistent and inventive. By mid-afternoon, the system was live. I tested each sensor, watching the camera feeds flicker to life on my phone. Every motion sensor, every entryway, every potential vulnerability was accounted for. I felt a strange satisfaction in the precision, a sense of control that I hadn't experienced in years. Protecting this house was no longer just about the property. It was about asserting the autonomy I had long deferred to others' expectations. It didn't take long for the test to prove effective. I saw a familiar SUV slow at the end of the driveway. Marissa, Tom, and the kids had arrived early, likely hoping to claim some advantage. Marissa tried the front door first. The alarm blared immediately, a voice announcing that unauthorized entry had been detected. She jumped back, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Oh, come on, Liana!" she shouted, banging on the door in frustration. Tom leaned against the car, avoiding conflict as usual, while the children peered out the windows. Confused, I pressed a button on my phone to activate a second warning. Calm, firm, and unmistakable. Every attempt they made to enter was met with immediate response. The sensors and cameras doing the talking I needed them to. Standing on the deck, watching their reactions, I couldn't help but feel a mix of humor and vindication. The audacity of entitlement was met with a system that demanded respect, and for the first time in years, the boundary between my life and theirs felt unbreachable. I knew this was only the beginning. Every measure I put in place today would ripple through the coming weeks, ensuring that my home and my decisions were not up for debate, preparing the way for the next challenge in this unfolding confrontation. By midweek, I received the first notification a moving company was scheduled to deliver Marissa's furniture to the beach house. I had anticipated this, of course, and had already arranged for a nearby storage facility to accept any deliveries temporarily. When the truck arrived, I met them at the driveway, presenting the storage unit's information and confirming that everything would be redirected. The movers hesitated, glancing at the large house behind me, then nodded and followed my instructions. I documented each step: photographs, timestamps, and receipts, knowing that any misstep could be spun against me. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was enforcing boundaries that had long been ignored. Still, I couldn't help noticing the tension in the air as I watched the movers load each sofa and dresser into the waiting trucks. Almost immediately, notifications began arriving on my phone. Marissa's social media posts painted a dramatic picture her cruel brother had blocked her family from their rightful beach vacation. She claimed, exaggerating the inconvenience and airing grievances to anyone who would listen. Comments flooded in from distant relatives and friends, expressing outrage and sympathy. I muted the notifications and focused on the process, reminding myself that the opinions of the uninvolved were irrelevant. By evening, the storage unit was full, all items accounted for, and I had paid for 6 months up front to prevent any immediate crisis. I had chosen the temporary solution deliberately, a balance between fairness and firmness. If the furniture had been left outside or in the house, I would have faced chaos during renovations. But the storage allowed for protection without unnecessary punishment. I reflected on the symbolism of it all. Redirecting the furniture wasn't simply a logistical choice. It was a demonstration that actions have consequences. Every attempt to overstep the boundaries I had set would meet a measured, predictable response. I could feel a subtle shift in my own confidence, a reinforcement of the principle that respecting property and agreements mattered as much as any family loyalty. Even as I stepped onto the back deck, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I knew that this was not the final confrontation. The furniture episode was only one chapter in a larger lesson, and the coming weeks would test both their persistence and my resolve, setting the stage for the next phase of renovation and assertion. The following morning, I arrived at the beach house just as the demolition crew was finishing their first sweep of the property. The familiar spaces, the living room where I had hosted quiet weekends, the master suite where I had painted and repainted walls over decades, were already stripped to their bare bones. Dust hung in the air, the scent of fresh timber and sawdust mingling with the salty breeze. I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing every measured swing of the hammer was reclaiming the space for my plans, my vision. I moved through the rooms, checking the crew's progress, confirming each wall slated for removal, each fixture scheduled for replacement. The master suite, the room Marissa had already mentally claimed as hers, was gutted, the old carpet ripped out, the faded 90s wallpaper removed. Reclaimed timber from a local fishing boat awaited installation along the accent wall, a detail I had insisted upon for months. It would give the suite character, a subtle reminder that this house reflected my tastes, my time, my care. Through the security feed, I caught glimpses of Marissa driving slowly past the property, her SUV lingering at the end of the driveway. Tom stayed behind the wheel, giving me nothing but an indifferent stare. I allowed a small smile. Every cautious probe they attempted met only with the unyielding reality of locks, alarms, and walls being dismantled according to my schedule. The house was no longer theirs to manipulate or invade. As I walked through the stripped hallways, I reflected on the symbolism of the demolition. Each crash, each removed panel, each cleared room represented more than physical transformation. It dismantled old patterns of entitlement, the unspoken expectation that family could override my plans, my priorities, or my autonomy. The noise of saws and hammers became almost therapeutic, a rhythmic assertion of control, a declaration that my boundaries were not negotiable. I checked the plans again with the contractor, confirming placement of every new fixture, every reclaimed beam. The open concept layout would finally highlight the ocean view, just as I had envisioned years ago, before family interference threatened to dictate the use of the rooms. Even the kitchen, once cluttered and outdated, would emerge as a space both functional and reflective of my personal aesthetic, prepared for years of enjoyment rather than temporary occupation by others. By mid-afternoon, the walls were half gone, the floors exposed, and the bones of the house visible in all their raw honesty. I paused on the deck, looking out at the water. Each wave that broke against the shore seemed to mirror the clarity I felt within, a reminder that reclaiming space, physical and emotional, was necessary for peace. The weeks ahead would test their persistence, but here, amidst the dust and debris, I knew the process had begun, and nothing short of complete renovation would secure the boundaries I had long deferred. The crew moved to the next room, hammers swinging in rhythm, and I returned inside, already planning the next phase, the next measures to ensure that my home and my peace remained entirely mine. Late that afternoon, I saw my parents' car pull into the driveway. I had expected them eventually, knowing their desire to mediate, but their timing felt deliberate, a subtle pressure to test my resolve. I stepped onto the deck, brushing sawdust from my hands, and watched as Mildred and George approached, their faces a mix of concern and mild reproach. "Liana," my mother began, her voice careful, "we need to talk about this. It's only fair to consider Marissa and the kids." I folded my arms, keeping my tone even. "I understand your concern, but the house isn't available. Renovations are scheduled, the contractors are working, and the plans cannot be changed on a whim. This is my property, and I will not compromise the schedule." My father's eyes flicked to the demolition underway inside, the exposed walls and stripped floors serving as a visual testament to my preparations. "It seems extreme," he said softly. "You're punishing your daughter-in-law over a misunderstanding." "It's not punishment," I replied, calm but firm. "It's enforcement of boundaries. The house is not theirs to occupy, and any furniture delivered before the renovations are complete must be redirected. I have documentation and signed agreements to support every step I've taken." My mother shifted uneasily, her hands clasped tightly. But family helps family. Surely a little accommodation just this once won't hurt. I shook my head, letting the weight of my words sink in. Family helping family does not include disregarding someone else's plans and property. This is not about Marissa or the children. This is about respect for agreements and boundaries. Years of deferred decisions have led to this moment. I will not allow entitlement to dictate my life anymore. For a long moment, they looked at me, the silence filled with the unspoken tension of decades of family dynamics. Then my father exhaled slowly, glancing toward the contractor and the half-demolished master suite. He nodded slightly, finally recognizing the reality I had carefully constructed: the documentation, the security measures, the clearly scheduled renovation. Everything made it impossible to argue against. I stepped back, allowing them to process the message without escalation. The confrontation had not been loud or angry, but it had been definitive. My authority over the property was unmistakable, and for the first time in years, I felt a quiet certainty that my decisions could not be overridden. As they turned to leave, I returned inside, already planning the next steps of the renovation and the measures that would ensure this lesson and these boundaries were fully enforced. Weeks passed, and the beach house gradually transformed under the careful oversight of the contractors. The stripped floors were replaced with reclaimed oak, walls painted in muted coastal tones, and the master suite emerged as a space that reflected my tastes and years of planning. Every detail, the placement of cabinets, the reclaimed timber accent wall, the open concept layout highlighting the ocean view, was executed according to my vision. I walked through the rooms daily, checking progress, but also allowing myself to absorb the sense of regained control, the constant tension of the past months, the unexpected claims, the arguments, the attempts to manipulate or bypass my authority felt less pressing now, replaced by satisfaction in seeing the tangible results of standing firm. Each completed section reinforced the boundaries I had set, the assertion of my agency, and the reminder that my decisions mattered. Occasionally, I checked the security feeds. Marissa and her family were still lingering on the outskirts, driving by or peeking from a distance. But the power of the renovations, combined with the security measures and documentation, made it clear they could not impose their will. There was a subtle shift in their demeanor, a quiet recognition that entitlement carried consequences, and that the house, like my decisions, was no longer theirs to control. As I moved through the spaces, I reflected not just on the house itself, but on the lessons embedded in the process. Protecting what was mine had required calm, foresight, and consistency. Maintaining distance had preserved both my property and my peace. Success in family relationships, I realized, was not always about compliance or pleasing others. It was about mutual respect and the willingness to enforce boundaries. Even when uncomfortable, standing on the deck, I watched the waves roll in, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The renovation was nearly complete, but more importantly, my authority and peace had been restored, readying me for the final stages of this process. By the following weekend, the beach house had been transformed completely. The walls gleamed in soft coastal tones. The floors reflected the warmth of reclaimed wood, and every room felt purposeful, functional, and unmistakably mine. The renovation had not only reshaped the physical space, but also marked the restoration of my autonomy, a visible testament to the boundaries I had enforced. Marissa came by briefly, her usual confidence subdued. She avoided the front entrance and instead approached me on the deck. "Liana," she said quietly, "I'm sorry for overstepping. I didn't think through what I was doing, and I shouldn't have assumed. Her voice lacked its usual insistence. For the first time, I sensed a genuine acknowledgement of the consequences of entitlement. I nodded, accepting her apology without comment, letting the simple act of recognition suffice. My parents visited later, this time with a restrained demeanor. There was no argument, no pressure, only a quiet acceptance that the house was no longer theirs to claim, and that I had exercised my judgment consistently and fairly. The weight of years spent conceding, compromising, and deferring to others' whims lifted, replaced by a calm certainty that I could protect what was mine while remaining fair and composed. Standing alone on the deck that evening, watching the sun set over the Atlantic, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The physical transformation of the house mirrored my own growth. Decades of patience, planning, and restraint had culminated in a space and a life defined on my terms. Protecting property, setting boundaries, and asserting personal agency were lessons reinforced through action. Regardless of age, the house was complete, my authority unquestioned, and the first true weekend of peace had arrived, opening the way for the next chapter of both the home and my life.